You are listening to the Palestine in America podcast. I'm your host, Nader. I'm joined by my co-host and our Politics Edition guest editor, Rasha Mubarak of Unbought Power. On today's episode, we have political analyst and strategist who is currently the policy advisor for Jeramy Anderson for mayor, Mohammed Khader. How you doing, Mohammed? And thank you for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
Welcome. So nice to see you.
Good to see you too.
I'm trying to think of the last time I saw you, but I'm blanking.
Might have been the last swearing in, or some event in DC probably.
Yeah.
Thanks again for joining us, Mohammed. Where I really want to start with this is if you could kind of take us back to growing up in Mississippi. I think you have a unique experience growing up as a Palestinian and as a Black American in this country, and especially in Mississippi. So how was that like growing up in Mississippi, and can you tell us a little bit about your early life?
Yeah, so growing up in Mississippi was, quite the challenge. I grew up in the state, post 9/11, which for a lot of us has defined a lot of our experiences. And it was, as I said, a challenge. I went to school throughout high school in Mississippi. So, a lot of my formative years were in the capital of Mississippi in Jackson. My family is from a very rural city, Mississippi. So, there's just a lot of dynamics that go on living in such a place like Jackson, Mississippi. But I mean, I'm very, in terms of how it's impacted me and just seeing different things that, a lot of people wouldn't have seen. There's a lot of your friends when you grow up are impacted by a lot of issues. And, being Palestinian American, it's very similar to how a lot of children, experience similar issues back home, whether that be in Gaza or West Bank. But Mississippi is, like any other place in the world, but it's very unique in the sense that a lot of the history that we are taught in an American education system is actually still playing out within the school system, within the society. Regardless of anywhere you go, you could actually be standing on a historical monument and never know. You could be standing on a former plantation. You could be standing on your ancestors' land and never know. But Mississippi is something that's very important to me, and it's something that shapes a lot of the things I do from my work to my personal perspective in life and stuff like that.
Ooh, that's a lot. Do you feel like growing up in Mississippi and being Palestinian and being Black has paved the way towards your political journey, or what really was the jumpstart?
Yeah, so I mean, it wasn't really until later in my life that I actually began to learn a lot more about my family in terms of, their political involvement, just because growing up in Mississippi, whether you're political or not, it's always politically charged. For example, we recently changed our state flag, something that shouldn't be as politically charged, but, some people are still holding on to past Confederate symbols and regalia. But for me, early on, my family were, active in terms of politics. My mom, for example, encouraged me to pursue things that I was passionate about. And, my father, him specifically, was very engaged in the whole idea of looking at the federal government in terms of, understanding what Congress does, how that impacts you, what does your state government do. So, my parents did have a role, but also my grandparents were very active in the civil rights. My uncle, for example, was one of the first people to lead a civil rights voter registration in the state of Mississippi. With people like Fannie Lou Hamer and MLK and others in the time. And, it was such a big thing to me that, a lot of these things I didn't know as a kid just because, it was just the time that we were living in. But now, when you have access to more information, a lot of the things have become digitized. So there's some archive projects and civil rights projects that have gone on, and Mississippi now has, I believe, one of the best civil rights museums in the country. Um, so just different stuff like that, and yeah, it's a combination of things. My political journey wasn't straight; it was pretty like curvy and like just not a straight path. But looking back at it now, a lot of that did shape my political views and my journey along the way.
You mentioned how the state changed its flag. Uh, Prior to us getting on this interview, you mentioned how Jeramy Anderson, who you work for, played a big role in getting that changed. Would you say that this is the most you ever believed in somebody that you work for in the political realm? And can you touch on why that might be, and any other experiences where you felt like, wow, I really didn't believe in this guy?
Yeah, so being a strategist and an analyst, for example, you get to engage with a lot of politicians and candidates. Within the last year, I worked with a lot of candidates throughout the country. I was actually campaign manager for a very local candidate, and I would say that's one of the few people I did believe in, truly, without a doubt. And recently I joined Jeramy Anderson campaign, and I'll probably say that that's one of the few people that I do believe in terms of not being unwavered or unbothered by, political view or a position. I would say Jeremy is a pretty committed guy. He's a very thorough person who understands different societal issues. But for me, having worked in the past for people that I couldn't really believe in was something that I felt that was draining, and I wouldn't encourage anybody to do it.
I
The
feel that
trade-offs.
hard, Mohammed.
Yeah, the trade-offs are just terrible. You're in a position where you just don't want to be in. You're complicit in a lot of things. Regardless of how good your heart is and how much of the world you believe in, it's just not something you need to put yourself through. And I've done it before. I hate to say that I've done it, but for a lot of people that probably begin their career, it may be something that's done frequently. But as you narrow your political views and become stronger on what you believe in, that shouldn't be something that you should ever put yourself through.
That's actually what I was going to ask you. Like, what advice do you have for folks within the Palestinian community, Black and Brown communities that are trying to get into this work? And oftentimes, we are marginalized in spaces that deem themselves quote progressive. How has what experiences have you had, and what recommendations and advice do you give young people trying to do the same?
Yeah, being Palestinian is pretty unique while also being Black, and it's something that I'm still navigating in terms of what spaces are for me or what spaces are not for me. But for those people who are like very, very Palestinian, where it's like they're very visibly Palestinian, or they have deep family roots, or they have deep in terms of like deep activism work, for example, whether that be on college campuses or within their community. It's something that I'm sure that a lot of people have questioned or have thought about. But one thing I would say is that you just need to ensure that when you go into a space, understand the dynamics you're getting involved to, understand the current landscape of the politics. There's a lot of groups that are parading around that are well intentioned, that take advantage of people like you and I, and it's very disheartening to see. But you have to do your due diligence and understand some of the spaces and the groups that are parading around trying to be the leaders of an issue area where frankly a lot of them don't belong in. I'm not saying Palestinians or Palestinian Americans, but specific groups. For example, businesses, what have you, people who want to attach their name to probably one of the most significant issues of our lifetime. I'm not sure if I answered the question fully, but yeah, I have a lot of different opinions on stuff like that. So.
No, that was a very good, very great answer. But that leads me to my next question. My follow-up to that is basically, obviously you've done that before where you didn't quite believe in somebody, and now you're on the other side where you kind of know what you want and where you're going to work for. That kind of like makes me think of what happened last week. And there's a point, right, where there is no return to our progressive side of things, right? Because like you said, you might have been somewhere where you didn't really believe in before, but it wasn't no far right wing storm the Capitol type movement, right? No rioting, you know what I mean? Like,
right.
So is there a warning to people that are going into politics saying, hey, you might want to further your career, but don't, you could step in the mud and be, labeled that way for a long time, maybe it's your life. Is that a warning you might want to give to people? Or
yeah, I mean, anything you do has risk, going back to the laws and science, every action has a positive or negative reaction. Some of them cancel each other out, others sustain themselves longer. Some things just never go away. For example, Nelson Mandela, when he ascended to the presidency of South Africa, Margaret Thatcher and a lot of people during the 70s and 80s labeled him as a terrorist. A figure that was too revolutionary to lead a nation of people once suppressed, who, broke from the chains of one of the most oppressive forms of government probably in modern history, especially within that region of the world. So one thing I would say is that, the current landscape of politics is very divisive. It's probably the most divisive we've seen since the Reconstruction era. For example, me going back to Mississippi during the Reconstruction era had 216 Black elected officials. We sent the first 2 members of Congress that were Black to the Senate. Yet there was white backlash that actually led racial terrorism against Black Mississippians through 1870 to 1950. We had the most lynchings, I believe, in the nation. Many of our counties had the highest lynching rates in the nation. So just looking at history, for example, a lot of the landscape is pretty reflective of that era. And, being, Palestinian or Black, or being a non-white person in America now, pursuing a political career, for some is, depending on the community you're in, it's very, I wouldn't say risky, but very, just dangerous to a level. A friend of mine, actually, Tay Anderson in Colorado, it's actually have been threatened. His life has been threatened several times. He's the youngest Black elected official in Colorado, and we're seeing a lot of that now. People who are pursuing careers to change their communities. He's on the school board. He rarely cares about his community, but there are people that don't care about the sanctity of life, about the sanctity of issues that they claim to care about. A lot of us want to have clean water in our communities, and people will rather care if you do or you don't. So what I would say to people is that, just know the risk of getting involved in going for the greater good of your people or your society will always be looked down upon by other people who don't care about the sanctity of life that they claim that they do. So it's just complicated with everything, to be honest.
100%. That was proven last Wednesday, where people were rioting and storming the Capitol without masks on.
Yeah.
And they don't care. Like, they pretend like they care about issues, but really, what do they care about? Keeping privacy and power and that sort of thing.
Yeah, and I would just like to say about that, I had a family member in the Capitol at the time of the insurrection, and they actually had to be evacuated. I believe the moment that they penetrated the front door to the Capitol. And they're doing work to ensure that members of Congress and staff are safe and free of COVID. But as you see, staffers, even members themselves, don't care about other people's lives. They're willing to put other people's lives at risk to further their own career. So, it's a win-win. It's a lose-lose. It's just people don't care. A lot of people don't care about other people's lives, and that's just it's a shame, to be honest with you.
No value for human life. And I think to both of your points, it's, you know, the white supremacists storming the Capitol. Yes, that's Trump. Yes, that's the Republican Party, but it's also establishment and Democrats who are complicit with how it's like, how did we get here, right? It's a lot of um wavering policies that are destructive towards Black and brown communities. That so it when we think about what happened last week, it's not just Trump and the Republican Party. It's on both sides of the aisle. And what's most dangerous now, as yes, we removed a fascist from office, and but under this new administration, Mohammed, there is a fear that this racist system and policies will further marginalize Black and brown communities. What's happening? You know, he wants to have more money for law enforcement. I'm sure, you know, continue to buckle down on aid to Israel. So what is you know, it's not so overt like Trump, right? So what is your fear, and how do you like how do you learn to navigate, and how do you influence others to be on the right side of justice when they're pushing policy or being a campaign operative? And how has that been for you?
Yeah. You know, I do have concerns about going forward for the next 4 years in terms of how true to our values are we going to be? Are we just going to, you know, allow things to happen just because, you know, we don't have the political power apparently to do certain things, or, you know, regardless of the majority, are we just going to allow things to be the norm in terms of the bipartisan, quote unquote, way of Washington, D.C.? But, you know, as a strategist, as somebody who's been involved, there are channels that can be done in terms of, you know, not doing politics as usual, really relying on local communities to lead the way in terms of pushing for reform and pushing for a lot of the progressive values and progressive ideas that have been formulated within the last few years, but also have been a continuation of things from the civil rights movement, to be honest with you. I just fear that, you know, we're gonna allow certain people who have, I don't want to say this the wrong way, people who have like closer ties to people dictate policies, dictate language that gets approved, in terms of like funders, in terms of donors, in terms of people who have quote unquote more experience than other people. Um, you know, the typical way of DC culture. Um, but I wouldn't say give up on that. I would say that there's been a lot of progress. It's been more kind of like a tug of war, if you will, in terms of trying to accomplish things and trying to ensure that, you know, policies that can get passed are passed and or even considered. My big concern is foreign policy, and I don't think we're going to actually move in the progressive direction that a lot of us hope that we will, just because a lot of what's been done over the past 40 plus years is essentially being recycled back into uh, the top of the chain, if you will. There are people that are at the top who have recently been appointed that are encouraging, but it's not a full, in terms of a full victory, if you will. There's hope, but I wouldn't put full emphasis on it. I still say we need to keep pushing in terms of you know, getting things like settlements and annexation fully addressed, reversing a lot of the arms deals that have been done, addressing the rampant complicity that's been done within the region of the Middle East and Africa, for example, on a lot of these, you know, essentially defense contractor pushing policies and actions and deals that have been done. But in terms of the next 4 years, I think it'll be a continuation of the past and not really a lot to be pushing towards the future from people at the top in terms of government. But yeah.
I think that's what a lot of people fear, is kind of what you just described, is basically getting back to the status quo of pre Trump era. And that leads me to ask you, is like, in a moment like this where you see that, where you see history about to repeat itself, is that a moment where you're like, man, is politics for me? Or is there a different moment in your life where you felt like, man, I would much rather move to a different route?
Yeah. I mean, yeah, probably
like, discouraged? Are you discouraged?
Yeah.
Are you? I know you said there's some hope, but like, man, I can, me personally, I can feel a little bit discouraged at that, you know, like, especially when you see everybody around you get all hyped for Biden, but realistically, you know, for people that are in amongst our communities, really what's going to change that's going to impact our life?
Yeah, I'm pretty, I would say, disenchanted, discouraged, if you will, on a lot of fronts. You know, I probably every other month or so for a while, I question whether politics were for me. I've had policy that I've written have been taken by an organization, a major organization actually, and you know now they're pushing their own language that is essentially pro CVE, PVE, which is violent extremism, counter violent extremism. When my policy was actually not that. I've had, you know, people who I've worked with just take things that I've, you know, worked so hard on and torn it apart. I've had a boss claim that they were progressive and turned up on a pro-police candidate. Like I've had terrible experiences.
Yeah.
You know, I've had terrible experiences in politics. Probably because I started young and nobody really showed me the ropes. And I'm still pretty young now, but
Baby
I get,
genius.
yeah, baby genius. But even now, like having a lot of years in the game, you know, I'm still discouraged just because, you know, a lot of people grab onto the terminologies and lexicons, if you will, of diversity and inclusion, or you know, the big flash or buzzwords, but they don't really mean it. But I mean, now I haven't had an experience like that in a while. I would say a couple months ago, I lost an election by 153 votes that I was the campaign manager for.
Wow.
And our information was deleted the day before election day. We suspect by a party member, and it was never recovered. Actually, the only way you could have deleted it was if you were a party member, because you couldn't see the trace of information flow. And we were barred from a specific area that we could have won the vote by. So, and we had a fourth candidate that was pushed into the race financially by a incumbent who ended up losing the race. So, you know, there was a lot of factors. I would say that would probably be the most recent time I've ever considered walking away from it all. I just, you know, politics is so corrupt.
But do you feel like, and I don't know if this isn't like an ego thing, but do you feel like if you walk away, who's going to be there to advocate, you know, in your place? Do you ever feel that way? Because, you know, like I feel like you might feel that way, but do you?
Yeah, and I mean, not to sound like having a big ego or anything, or just
Definitely.
being
I didn't
like,
mean it like that, but yeah.
yeah, no, but I agree. Like I mean, I don't like to talk about my work or like flaunt it a lot, but like I would say.
But I think it's so important, Mohammed, that you do.
Yeah.
And like I feel like since I've known you, I was like, you were like, when I met you in DC, like I was like, who are you? And how come I never met you before? Like you are doing the damn thing. Just so I just want to put that out there.
Thank you. I really appreciate that. And you know, there's times where I feel that my presence or my work isn't really appreciated sometimes. And you know, anything you put your effort in, you want it to be at least acknowledged to the slightest degree. But yeah, there's some times where I'm gonna be honest with you. I feel like if it wasn't for me a part of something, I feel like it wouldn't have been the same, or it wouldn't have been done. Like I've spent literal hours and hours at a time, you know, in offices and meetings and, you know, places doing a lot of this work that you know, people claim that they do, but they can't really do it. At least in the same way that I do it. But I don't know. It's just something that I think comes with the territory. You know, if you put in the work, obviously, like, your work would make a different impact than another person's work who may not have been involved for a long time. Like, you know what to do, the right things to say, the right strings to pull. But no, I'm gonna be honest with you. I feel like sometimes if I wasn't in the room, the conversation would go left or right, or not really see the direction it should be, or, you know, the right thing when they get put on the paper. To be honest with you, I'm just keep it real.
No, 100%, because in any job, experience is key. All right,
Yeah.
and if you leave, then there's gonna somebody who might have the same intentions as you. They gotta go years through experience to get to the level that you're at, and by the time they get there, our operatives might be way surpassed them. So I'm so glad that you haven't been, pushed away from the work, because we need people like you, and Palestine America is here to uplift the work that you do, because there needs to be an outlet that shouts out the work that our people do. And you're in the trenches, like Russia's in the trenches, and a lot of people don't know about people like y'all who are actually putting in the work, and instead we're over here celebrating people that aren't doing nothing. So definitely appreciate you taking the time to talk to us about everything that you do. And every time we talk to you, we're going to try to get you to hype yourself up. We want to know about everything that you're doing. So definitely appreciate you.
Thank you.
Mohammed, I think it's important also folks know, like, you are Palestinian, you are Black, and there are Black Palestinians, but you've come from. So, like, how has these identities, like, you've experienced anti-Blackness in Palestinian spaces, or you've come across progressives except on Palestine, and how have you taken these struggles and carried it with you in this work, or put people in their place, accountability?
Anti-Blackness it's something that's really, I would say, interesting, I guess is the best way to put it, just because it shows up in a lot of different ways. Racism is something that I'm familiar with, just growing up in Mississippi and the Deep South. But I never felt, outside of my community until I, moved out of the South. Actually, when I was a teenager, I moved from Mississippi to Maryland. And that was essentially the first time where I became immersed within, a very dominant Arab community. There were a lot of Egyptians and Palestinians and others in the area. And at first, when I came into the community, a lot of people thought I was Somali or East African. But, that was just something that I guess I was expected. But, as I began to get involved politically, professionally as well, that anti-Blackness became something different. It became something that, you're not enough of something to be in the room, or, you can't do this thing, or, you don't have a full grasp of this thing just because, we assume that you're from Mississippi, you're not from, Jerusalem or from, any other town or village throughout Palestine. Like, you're just you. So that was very disheartening, but over time it's just something that I've had to deal with. It's something that, comes with the territory, but anti-Blackness, I would say, in the Palestinian community and Arab community is something that's very unique, and we have a long ways to go before we dismantle it fully. But I've appreciated a lot of the work, you've been doing, and people like McComb and others have been trying to do, approaching anti-Blackness within the community at large.
Sorry, but I wanted to really quickly ask, because I see like the minutes that we've been asking folks like what their favorite like Palestinian song or quote or book or poet or something that, like, we are a culture where we believe resist to exist is also in the arts. That's always been. So just curious if you have something.
And before you
Mhm.
answer, I just wanted to chime in.
Sorry.
No, it's okay. I don't know if you see the time remaining, Muhammad,
I
but
do.
okay, perfect. So
Yeah.
when it gets down to like the 1 minute mark, if you're
Mhm.
answering a question, like please try to wrap it up, and then so that we can have time to close out our
Yeah.
episode. But perfect question from Russia, if you can answer that. Thank you.
Yeah. I would say one of my favorite. I don't know. I like Mahmoud Darwish. I like him a lot. He's probably my go-to guy. Um, or I don't know. I'm a very big food person, so I treat food as a cultural art, if you will.
Hell
There's a lot
yeah.
of history in food, especially Palestinian. There's a lot like food or just regional things like when I first I wouldn't say first, but when I first learned about regional thogues, like women's thogues, I thought that was actually something pretty cool. Um, but yeah, I'm a very big like literature guy, so Mahmoud Darwish will probably be my go-to for anything, and then food second, and then just our different culture, regional stuff within Palestinian culture.
I kind of wanted to the culture question. I wanted to jump back to what we were talking about just before. Not so much the racism in Palestinian community, because obviously
Mm,
that needs work, and I address it in my family. I'm sure Russia addresses it wherever it comes up around her. Um,
mm.
but what would you say between the two cultures, like, is the most similar, or something that like you love to introduce to your other side of the family?
Mm,
Like Debka to your black side of the family, or
yeah,
what I mean, like footworking to your Arab
yeah.
side of the family.
Uh, yeah. Well, actually, similarity will probably be dance. Uh, a lot of Black American culture. Well, I shouldn't say Black American. A lot of Black people. When we come together and congregate, and for example, dance is something that I guess kind of unites us, or it's something that just comes up. We have line dancing. We have just a lot of things that are coordinated with music, similar to Dabka for Palestinians. Food. There's some similarities. For example, in Mississippi, we have stuff like okra. One of our universities is called the Fighting Okra, if you believe that. And I'm a big fan of Bamia. Um, I know a lot of people aren't, but there's a lot of
I was just gonna say unpopular opinion.
yeah, I
People
know.
are
One
they're
popular
always
opinion.
like they're like the texture, but like when you
Oh,
get older,
hot take alert.
Mm.
I love
I have a
it
lot of
too
hot takes.
though.
Yeah, but I mean, yeah, it's food and probably art are very similar. Um, yeah, I would just say food and art, and I would probably introduce both sides to probably literature. We have people like Richard Wright from, Richard Wright, James Baldwin, Mahmoud Darwish. They're like a lot of the writings are actually very similar, but it's just the contexts are very regionalized and very specific to their land and society, I guess, at in large for their point of view.
I love it.
I was muted. I didn't know I was muted. Anyway, Muhammad, I would just,
Mm.
as the time is running out, I think this is the perfect moment. I think that was the perfect way to close things out. Um, I really appreciate you giving us the time. Russia, do you have anything to say before
Yo, I just want to say, Mohammed, since I've met you, like you are someone that I look to that in this work that not only gets it, but has understands what it means to struggle in this work, and people don't understand what it means to be Black, Palestinian, and to be both in this work. So, and just how you've been able to continue to overcome, and you deserve to be acknowledged, but also I just want to uplift how you've impacted in through campaigning, or just like how you've helped with policy. And I'm just excited, and I hope you don't forget folks like Nader and I when you run for office one day.
Thank you, and I really do appreciate that. And I would like to say as well, you also been a similar impact as well. Um, I would just say, like, before I came into the space, I'm gonna be honest with you. I would say I had a bleak view in terms of, okay, this is what I want to do, but this is also who I'm gonna look to. I just had the very, narrow framing of just things. But, over time, as obviously when you grow and things evolve. And, I appreciate, people like y'all and just a lot of other people in our community that, a lot of people that go nameless, but a lot of people that are out there publicly in terms of doing the work to build political power for our people. And, I do appreciate being recognized, for the work that I try to do at least. And appreciate y'all for the work that y'all do as well.
Thank you so much. And definitely, I would definitely agree with what you said about Russia. But that was a wonderful way for us to close out this episode. Thank you so much to our listeners for listening to this episode of Palestine in America podcast. I'm your host, Nader Mahmoud. I was joined today by my co-host and our Politics Edition guest editor, Rosha Mubarak of Umbat Power. On today's episode, we talked to a Palestinian that you definitely need to know. He is a political analyst and strategist who is currently the policy advisor for Jeramy Anderson for mayor, Mohammed Khader. So thanks again, Mohammed, for joining us, and everybody go check out his work and make sure you follow him on all social medias and to keep up with all the great work that he's doing for our communities. Thanks again, Mohammed.
Thank you.
Thanks, Mohammed.